The wheelchair had been sitting in the hospital corridor for nearly 40 minutes, and every person who passed Mason Reed seemed to find a reason not to stop. A transporter glanced at him and kept walking. A nurse hurried past with a stack of charts. An orderly looked directly at the brake on his chair, saw that it had slipped loose, and continued toward the elevators anyway. Mason said nothing. His hands rested quietly on the worn armrests, fingers curled with the disciplined stillness of a man who had spent years learning how to remain calm when everything around him was falling apart. The fluorescent lights above him hummed with a faint electrical buzz, reflecting against the polished floor and making the corridor feel colder than it actually was. His duffel bag sat beside one wheel, faded navy blue fabric marked with scratches that had survived more places than anyone in that hospital would ever know. At 42, Mason still carried himself like a soldier, even though his body no longer obeyed the commands his mind gave it. His shoulders were broad beneath a plain gray sweatshirt, his hair cut short, his face clean-shaven, his eyes fixed on the doors across the corridor. 3 months earlier, those eyes had belonged to a man who could cross a room without thinking about every movement. Now he had to measure everything: the angle of his chair, the distance to the bathroom, the strength required to transfer from one surface to another. The smallest tasks had become calculations. He had been discharged from rehabilitation that morning with a folder of instructions, several medication schedules, and a sentence that still sounded unreal every time he remembered it. "You are ready to continue your recovery at home." Home. The word felt almost insulting. His apartment had stairs at the entrance. The bathroom door was too narrow for his chair. His kitchen counters were too high. The hospital knew this. Mason had explained it twice. Yet somehow he had still ended up alone in the corridor waiting for a transportation service that had apparently forgotten he existed. A young nurse passed him carrying a cup of coffee. Mason watched her disappear around the corner. He could have called again. The call button was clipped to the side of his chair. He could have pressed it and demanded someone come. But Mason had learned a long time ago that demanding help did not make help arrive faster. So he waited. That was what soldiers did when they had no other option. They waited. They watched. They endured. Across the corridor, Elena Torres stepped out of a patient room and stopped. She was 29, tired enough that the coffee in her hand had gone cold, but observant enough to notice what most people ignored. She saw the man in the wheelchair before she saw the paperwork in her hand. Something about him bothered her. Not because he looked angry. He did not. Not because he was causing trouble. He was not. It was precisely because he was doing nothing. People who were abandoned usually complained eventually. They called. They argued. They made themselves impossible to ignore. Mason Reed had done none of those things. He simply sat there as though he had already decided that expecting anything from people was a mistake. Elena looked at the wall clock. 43 minutes. She walked toward him. Mason noticed her before she spoke. His eyes shifted briefly toward her shoes, then returned to the elevator doors. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked. "Transportation," he replied. His voice was low and rough without anger. "How long?" Mason glanced at the clock. 43 minutes. Elena looked at the call button. "Did you tell the desk?" "Yes. And they said someone is coming." Elena studied his face. There was something controlled about him that did not fit the situation. Most patients in his position would have been frustrated. Mason seemed almost embarrassed that anyone had noticed. She crouched beside the chair. "May I check the brake?" Mason hesitated. Then he nodded. Elena touched the lever and discovered the problem immediately. The brake was loose enough that the chair could roll backward if he shifted his weight. She tightened it and tested both wheels. Mason watched without saying anything. "Thank you." She stood. "You should not have been left here alone." His eyes finally met hers. "I have been left in worse places." Elena did not know what to say to that. She noticed the faded duffel beside him and the small stitched emblem near the zipper. It was not a current military insignia. It looked older, worn, personal. She glanced at the folder on his lap. The top page had his name printed across it. Mason Reed. Beneath it were several medical notes and a discharge summary. At the corner of one page was a small handwritten notation that caught her attention. Go 6. She almost ignored it. Instead, she looked at Mason again. Is that your call sign? His jaw tightened. For the first time, something changed in his expression. Not anger, not fear. Recognition. Where did you see that? On your file. Mason reached for the folder, but Elena had already stepped back. She could feel the atmosphere between them shift. It was as though the quiet corridor had suddenly become a different place. Ghost 6 was not the kind of name people casually wrote on a hospital file. Mason lowered his eyes. It is old. Elena nodded. I figured. He looked toward the elevator again. You do not have to worry about me. That sentence stayed with her. Not because of what he said, but because of how quickly he said it. People who were fine rarely needed to convince strangers they were fine. Elena walked to the nurse's station and checked the transportation request. There had been a scheduling error. The vehicle had been assigned to another patient. No one had noticed Mason was still waiting. When Elena returned, Mason was trying to reposition himself. The chair shifted unexpectedly. His hand grabbed the wheel. For one brief second, his balance failed. Elena reached out instinctively and steadied the chair. Mason froze. His breathing changed. Elena immediately released the handle. Sorry, I should have asked. Mason stared at the floor. You did not do anything wrong. But the words sounded like they had been pulled from somewhere deep inside him. Elena could see the humiliation he was trying to hide, and she understood that the wheelchair was not the hardest part of his recovery. It was the constant awareness that every room now contained 100 things he could no longer do without assistance. She stepped away and gave him space. A few minutes later, an administrator approached carrying a clipboard. Mr. Reed, we are going to move you back into observation until transportation can be arranged. Mason looked up. I was already discharged. The administrator sighed. We know, but you cannot remain in the corridor. Mason looked toward Elena. Something passed between them, brief and uncertain. He had been ignored by dozens of people that morning, yet somehow the one nurse who had stopped was now the only person standing between him and being moved somewhere he did not want to go. Elena looked at the clipboard. Then she looked at Mason. There was a small plastic identification card attached to the inside pocket of his duffel bag, partly visible beneath the zipper. She could see only 2 words. Ghost 6. She did not know why that detail mattered. She only knew that Mason had reacted to it as though someone had opened a locked door inside him. Elena took a breath and said the name quietly. Ghost 6. Mason went completely still. His eyes lifted toward hers, and for the first time since she had met him, the guarded expression disappeared. Behind it was something wounded, exhausted, and almost painfully human. He looked at her for several seconds before whispering the one question she never expected to hear. Who told you that name? Elena did not answer immediately, because Mason was no longer looking at her like a patient. He was looking at her like someone who had accidentally spoken a name that belonged to another life. The administrator shifted impatiently beside them and reminded Mason that the observation unit was waiting, but Mason kept his eyes on Elena. Finally, she pointed toward the folder in his lap. It was written on one of the older pages. I did not know it meant something. Mason looked down. It means someone remembered me. The sentence was so quiet that Elena almost missed it. She glanced at the administrator and asked for another few minutes. The administrator refused. Mr. Reed cannot remain in this corridor indefinitely. Elena looked at Mason. Mason gave a small nod. Let them move me. He sounded resigned, not frightened. Elena followed as they pushed him toward the observation unit, but something inside her refused to let the matter end there. She had spent years around patients who hid pain behind anger, humor, or silence. Mason was different. His silence was not hiding pain. It was protecting someone. Later that afternoon, Elena reviewed his records. The medical notes explained the physical injuries but not the man. There were pages describing rehabilitation goals, mobility limitations, medication schedules, and long-term care recommendations. Then she found the military history. Mason Reed had served for 14 years. His last deployment had ended with a catastrophic injury that left him paralyzed. The official report was brief. 1 casualty. 1 survivor. Mission compromised. No further details. Elena read the page twice. 1 casualty. 1 survivor. She remembered the way Mason had reacted when she called him Ghost 6. There was a story buried somewhere inside those words. That evening she found him sitting alone beside a window. The hospital had moved him into a quieter room, but the loneliness followed him. His duffel bag was on the floor. His hands rested on his knees. Outside, rain traced thin lines down the glass. Elena entered carrying a cup of tea. Mason looked at it but did not reach for it. "I am not supposed to have caffeine," he said. "It is herbal." He nodded. "Thank you." Elena sat in the chair across from him. She did not mention the call sign. She waited. Eventually Mason spoke. "They used to call me Ghost 6 because I was good at disappearing." Elena smiled faintly. "That sounds useful in your line of work." It was. Then his expression changed. "Until the night I disappeared for real." Elena said nothing. Mason looked toward the rain. His team had been operating in a remote area when everything went wrong. He spoke carefully, never giving details that sounded like a report. There had been confusion, a sudden change in the situation. Someone had been injured. Mason had been trapped. Another member of the team had stayed behind. His name was Daniel Cole. Mason's voice became quieter. Daniel was supposed to leave with the others. He did not. Because I was still there. Elena felt her chest tighten. Mason continued. The official report said Daniel was lost during extraction. But Mason had never accepted that wording. He believed Daniel had made a choice that saved his life. A choice Mason considered unforgivable. "You survived," Elena said. Mason nodded. "That was the problem." He looked at her. "I was the one who came home." Elena let the silence remain. She understood that some wounds became worse when people rushed to fill them with comforting words. Mason took a breath. Daniel had a younger sister. Her name was Claire. After the mission, Mason found out she had been struggling. He sent money anonymously. He helped with bills. He never told her where it came from. He had spent years quietly protecting the family of the man he believed had died because of him. Elena asked why he never told Claire the truth. Mason's eyes lowered. Because then she would know her brother died saving someone who could not even save himself. Elena wanted to tell him that was not fair. But Mason was not asking for judgment. He was carrying a sentence he had given himself. The next morning, the hospital administrator informed Elena that Mason's care was being transferred. The hospital considered him too difficult to discharge safely and too medically complicated for ordinary home support. A long-term facility had accepted him. Mason listened without argument. When the administrator left, Elena entered his room. "You knew this was coming." Mason nodded. "They said I have limited options. Do you want to go there?" Mason looked at the window. "No." "Then why are you agreeing?" "Because I am tired of fighting." The words struck Elena harder than any angry outburst could have. She pulled a chair closer. "You are not tired of fighting. You are tired of fighting alone." Mason looked at her. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Elena noticed the small card tucked inside his duffel bag. She recognized the handwriting on it from the military notation in his file. "Ghost 6. She asked if she could see it. Mason hesitated before handing it over. The card was old, scratched, and slightly bent. On the back was a date from the night of the mission. Beneath it were 4 handwritten words. "You owe me a future." Elena stared at the sentence. Mason looked away. Daniel wrote it. Before the mission. Elena felt something shift. Why would he write that before the mission? Mason did not answer. Maybe he was joking. Maybe it meant something else. But his voice lacked conviction. That night Elena contacted the hospital records department and asked for any archive documentation connected to Mason's original admission. She expected nothing. Instead, she found an old digital file that had never been attached to his current medical record. It contained a scanned military audio transcript. The file was marked restricted. Elena should have stopped there. Instead, she read the first line. Ghost 6 was not the only call sign mentioned. Daniel Cole was listed beside it. Then she saw the timestamp. It was recorded several minutes before the mission ended. Elena opened the audio. At first there was only static. Then a voice appeared. Calm. Young. Familiar from Mason's descriptions. Daniel Cole. Elena listened as Daniel said Mason's call sign. Ghost 6. If you are hearing this, you made it out. There was a pause. Then Daniel said something that made Elena stop breathing. Do not let him believe this was his fault. The recording continued, but Elena barely heard the rest. She stared at the screen, realizing that Mason had spent years carrying a guilt that someone had specifically tried to prevent. The next morning she entered Mason's room holding the file. He saw her face and immediately knew. What did you find? Elena placed the tablet on the table. Mason looked at it, then at her. His expression hardened. Do not. Elena shook her head. You need to hear this. Mason looked away. I already know what happened. No, she said softly. You know what you were told happened. Mason turned back toward her. The room became completely still. Elena pressed play. Static filled the space. Then Daniel's voice came through the speaker. Ghost 6. If you are hearing this, you made it out. Mason's face changed. His lips parted, but no sound came. Elena watched as years of certainty began to crack. Daniel continued speaking. I need you to understand something. Mason closed his eyes. Elena lowered the volume slightly, but he raised one hand. Keep it on. The recording continued. And then Daniel said the words that turned Mason's entire memory of that night upside down. I was never trapped with you. I stayed because I was supposed to make sure you came home. Mason opened his eyes. For the first time, Elena saw something she had not seen since the day she met him. Hope frightened him more than grief ever had. For several seconds after the recording ended, Mason did not move. The rain had stopped outside, leaving the hospital window covered in pale morning light, and somewhere beyond the room a cart rolled down the corridor with a soft metallic rattle. Elena remained beside the tablet, afraid that even one unnecessary word might break something that had taken years to reach the surface. Mason stared at the screen where Daniel Cole's name was still visible. Play it again. Elena did. Daniel's voice returned through the speaker, older than Mason remembered and somehow closer than memory. He explained that the decision had been deliberate. Mason had been injured and could no longer move without assistance, and Daniel had understood that staying behind was the only way to give the rest of the team enough time to get Mason out. He had recorded the message because he knew Mason would blame himself. Then came the sentence that changed everything. You owe me a future, not a grave, not guilt, a future. Mason lowered his head. His hands began to tremble, and he pressed them together as if discipline could still command them to stop. For years he had believed survival was something he had stolen. Now he understood that Daniel had given it to him. Elena did not touch him. She simply stayed. That was what Mason needed most. Not another speech about courage. Not another person telling him he was strong. Someone willing to remain when there was nothing convenient to say. The hospital administrator eventually entered with paperwork for the long-term facility, but Elena asked him to wait. Mason looked at the forms for a long time. Then he pushed them away. I am not ready to go there. The administrator frowned. Mr. Reed, your current living situation is not suitable. I know. Then what is your plan? Mason looked toward Elena. For the first time, he did not look embarrassed to need an answer. "I do not have one yet," the administrator sighed, but Elena had already begun making calls. There was a rehabilitation coordinator who knew of an accessible temporary apartment. There was a veterans support organization that could help with modifications. There were people Mason had never contacted because asking for help had felt like admitting defeat. By afternoon, the first piece of that new life was taking shape. It was not miraculous. There was no sudden cure. Mason still could not walk. His body had not changed because of a recording. The wheelchair remained beside his bed. The medications remained on the table. The hard work of rehabilitation remained ahead of him. What changed was the meaning of those things. For the first time, Mason stopped seeing assistance as proof that he had become less of the man he once was. He began seeing it as something Daniel had wanted him to accept. A week later, Elena accompanied Mason to a small memorial service for Daniel. Claire was there. She was older than Mason remembered from the photographs, carrying the quiet exhaustion of someone who had spent years mourning without answers. Mason almost turned around at the entrance. Elena stopped beside him. "You do not have to say anything." Mason nodded. Claire noticed him anyway. She approached slowly. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Mason handed her the old card. Claire read the words on the back. "You owe me a future." Her eyes filled with tears. "He wrote that for you," she whispered. Mason shook his head. "He wrote it for me." Claire looked at the wheelchair, then back at Mason. "My brother never wanted you to spend your life apologizing for surviving." Mason's eyes closed. A tear moved down his cheek. He did not wipe it away. For years, he had believed strength meant never letting anyone see what hurt. That afternoon, surrounded by people who had known Daniel before the mission, he finally understood that strength could also mean allowing the truth to hurt without running from it. Months passed. Mason returned to rehabilitation, not because someone promised he would walk again, but because he had finally found a reason to build a life around the reality he had. He learned new ways to move through ordinary spaces. He learned how to ask for help without apologizing. He learned that independence did not always mean doing everything alone. Sometimes it meant choosing who was allowed to stand beside you. Elena remained part of his recovery, though she was careful never to become the center of it. She had simply been the person who stopped in a corridor when everyone else kept walking. One afternoon, Mason returned to the same hospital for a follow-up appointment. He paused in the corridor where he had once waited alone. The same lights hummed overhead. The same polished floor reflected the ceiling. A nurse hurried past. An orderly pushed a cart toward the elevators. For a moment, the old loneliness returned. Then Mason looked down at the call button attached to his chair. He pressed it. A young staff member approached and asked if he needed anything. Mason smiled. "Yes, I need help getting to radiology." The words were simple, but for Mason they were enormous. He did not feel ashamed when the nurse helped him turn the chair. He did not feel weak when another person opened the door. Somewhere inside him, Daniel's voice seemed almost close enough to hear. "You owe me a future." Mason had spent years believing that future had to be earned through suffering. Now he understood something gentler. A future was not a debt paid through pain. It was a gift honored by living. And sometimes the person who seems most determined to be left alone is not asking the world to disappear, but quietly waiting to discover whether anyone will stay. Elena never forgot the first time she called him Ghost 6. Mason never forgot that she had been the first person in years to say the name without pity. Their lives moved forward in different directions, but the lesson remained between them, quiet and permanent. People often mistake dignity for self-sufficiency, but dignity can also be found in trusting another person enough to say, "I cannot do this alone." Mason had survived the mission, survived the injury, survived the guilt, and finally survived the belief that survival itself was something to regret. He did not become the man he had been before the war. He became someone new, carrying the same courage into a life that demanded a different kind of bravery. And if there was one thing he finally understood, it was this. Sometimes saving a life does not end when the danger is over, because the hardest rescue can be teaching someone who survived that they are still allowed to live. So when Mason rolled through those hospital doors again, he did not look back at the corridor where no one had wanted to help him. He looked ahead, toward the open doors and the waiting light, carrying Daniel's final gift with him. And for the first time in many years, the man once known as Ghost 6 was no longer disappearing. He was going home.